I'm very happy to welcome Dr. Rana Miqati to, well, she's no stranger to Cairo, and so we're very happy that she's back. She's currently Associate Professor at the College of Charleston and also a fellow, I think, at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton. She's the author of a very recent book, Creating an Islamic City, Beirut, Jihad, and the Sacred. And I think we all earnestly pray for Beirut to return to its the thriving city that it once was and will be again. She's written on topics which really, I was just telling her before our talk, you know, Bilad al-Sham, Beirut, Awzāʿī, these figures are kind of, in a way, silenced in modern scholarship. So we're very happy that she's going to give voice to them today. I asked Rana about this picture, so I'm going to let her explain. But please, Rana, thank you.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for all of you who are still here. I want to thank everybody, especially Adrian and Ahmad, for organizing this, and everyone at IDEO for making this possible with all the complications of bringing all of us here. And I thank the audience and look forward to your questions. As Ahmad pointed out, I wrote a book recently about early Islamic Beirut, and Al-Awzāʿī features heavily in it. And so when I learned from Ahmad about the conference, I was very happy to go back to this topic. Now, speaking of the image that you have here in the back, well, this is, as I was telling you, not how I imagine Al-Awzāʿī. This is a stamp issued by the Lebanese government kind of in the aftermath of the civil war in commemoration of Al-Awzāʿī, because the figure of Al-Awzāʿī becomes kind of, especially after the Lebanese civil war, kind of a figure of tolerance. And this is connected to Al-Awzāʿī's writings on behalf, advocating for the Christians of Lebanon in the Abbasid period. So that's kind of the context, that this is where the image comes from. The thing is, obviously, as Ahmed pointed out, Al-Awzāʿī might be an unknown for some of us here, so I'll start with a quick biographical sketch. There's been plenty of works written about Al-Awzāʿī in Arabic language, not as much in Western scholarship. And as you can immediately see from, for example, that book cover here, Al-Awzāʿī is considered imam from A'immat Salaf, let's say. So there's that. So who was Al-Awzāʿī? First of all, Al-Awzāʿī was born in the Lebanon area, in the Beqa', in a village in the vicinity of Baalbek. It's unclear, there's a dispute whether he's a Mawla or of Arab origin. He was orphaned at a young age, and his mother brought him up. And basically, he enrolls very early on in his youth in the Diwan, meaning he becomes a soldier. And that was going to be his career. Obviously, he participates in expeditions. We don't know which ones. We have kind of like reference sometimes in the literature about where he went. But the key one is he is sent on an expedition to Al-Yamama in eastern Arabia because there were Kharijite uprisings in the Umayyad period, and he was there kind of to part of the forces to quell these uprisings. And it is in Al-Yamama that he discovers ilm and decides to abandon the Diwan, abandon the army, and starts studying under Yahya ibn Abi Kathir, who was a Madani scholar who also went to Yamama because he had kind of run afoul with the Umayyads. And so basically Al-Awzāʿī's education starts with a Madani scholar. Having studied with him and exhausted everything that Yahya ibn Abi Kathir can give him, He is told by his master that he should go to Basra. And so he goes to Basra. He arrives too late to study under Al-Hasan al-Basri, but he studies under Ibn Sirin and others. From there, he returns to Damascus and joins the circles of Zuhri and Makhul. And so basically, kind of his intellectual journey is clearly Medinese, Basran, and Syrian. And so after returning to Damascus, that kind of puts an end to his travels, collecting ilm. There are reports that he travels to Mecca, obviously for pilgrimage, but that's about it. He becomes basically like Ahl al-Futya, and he's asked questions. He gives his legal opinions in the year 113. This coincides with the death of Makhul. So basically, he's portrayed as someone who's inheriting kind of that position. Now, as the Umayyad dynasty starts unraveling and it collapses, Al-Awzāʿī moves to Beirut for safety reasons, because of happens in Damascus. And so the majority or the rest of his career, a good 25 years or so, is actually in Beirut. And this is important, especially for me in the book, because he moves from the center of empire, Damascus, under the Umayyads, to the periphery of the empire that has even become more marginal, because now Syria itself, under the Abbasids, has moved from being the capital to being a kind of a part of the periphery. So he's now a scholar operating on the periphery of the periphery. But yet he still manages to acquire a reputation. So the thing is, before delving into the details of his view of the Salaf, as much as we can go into it, given the sources, when Ahmed asked me to talk, kind of if I wanted to speak on this issue, I was always happy to come back to that, because tackling the legal corpus of Al-Awzāʿī is not something that I've done in the book, and that is something that's pretty difficult to do given the source material. That even, so there's been recently a book about Al-Awzāʿī in the Makers of the Muslim World by Stephen Judd, that really, as Professor Melchert himself kind of stated, shies away from trying to characterize Al-Awzāʿī's madhab in any way, partially because of the difficulty of it. So this is kind of a challenge that one has to tackle. Also, I have personal reasons to talk about Al-Awzāʿī. I feel Shamis of the early period, anything before Al-Shafi'i in the Syrian context, is just glossed over or entirely forgotten. So we're trying here to make Syrians speak. So there's kind of all of these elements to it. Also, the other, and that's the book cover, I have personal reasons here, so kind of to put it out there. During my research for the book, discovered that I have family connections to Awzāʿī himself. The Beirutis and the Lebanese all have some kind of connection to him, and just in the burial chamber of Al-Awzāʿī, started research, I found that a great uncle of mine had written a poem about him. And then in my research about kind of the development of the image of Al-Awzāʿī and the development of lieu de mémoire around him, found that one of my great grandfather basically was someone who studied in the Madrasa Al-Awzāʿī and took a Nabulsi around when he came on his rihla to show him all of these lieu de mémoire connected to Al-Awzāʿī. So beyond, though, the personal, why Al-Awzāʿī? Because he lived on the periphery. So why does he become important, and why should we look at him? He becomes basically an essential figure that's convenient to a certain extent for early Syrian Sunnism, kind of the orthodoxy of within the Syrian context. And that kind of connects to Ahmad's book to a certain extent, the regional aspect to it. There are other Syrian scholars who could have fulfilled that role, but they have problems. So for example, one of his contemporaries, Sa'id ibn Abdulaziz, who dies in 167, was very active, close to the Umayyad court, could have been considered as important, but he had Qadari leanings. And so in kind of that creating an image, building up a certain, early Syrian orthodoxy, Sa'id ibn Abdulaziz would not have, been amenable to that. While Al-Awzāʿī had he hit all the right notes. So he was anti-Qadar and basically anti-Qadar in a way that could be proven. He has written a risala about it. He also reportedly was chosen by Hisham ibn Abd al-Malik to debate Ghaylan al-Dimashqi. At least he's one of the people showed to have debated him. So he has the pedigree of being anti-Qadari. He's anti-Ra'i and opposed to Abu Hanifa and the school that he represented. He is an Umayyad loyalist. Nonetheless, managed to maintain this kind of healthy cooperation and distance with the authorities. So when the Abbasids came to town, he refused to legitimize them. And there's kind of this famous debate between him and Abdullah ibn Ali, where he's like, is what we've done legitimate? And he gives him all of these answers where he's basically saying no, but in a very diplomatic way. Yet he manages to cooperate with them and advocate for the Muslim community and the Christian communities in Lebanon, despite his opposition to the Abbasids. So basically, quietist, but Umayyad loyalist, etc. There's also other aspects to his, let's say, Syrian proto-Sunnism, but it's beyond the scope of this conference, which is the issue of the tafdeel and kind of the position of Ali when it comes to these. But that's a different question. We can deal with it if there are questions about it. Now, this image, this kind of idea that Awzāʿī is the proto-Sunni par excellence, who was the representative of Syrian scholarship, was built by Syrian scholars that have been totally ignored in the literature. In the 2nd and the 3rd century of the Hijrah, this is where we basically see the creation of the image of Al-Awzāʿī. And I'm going to only mention 2 key representatives of that movement of creating a Syrian madhab of sorts, an Awzāʿī madhab, and that's Al-Walid ibn Muslim. And Al-Walid ibn Muslim is actually an interesting figure on his own, not just because of his relationship with Al-Awzāʿī. He's a Mawla who was basically, his clientage, his wala was to the Umayyad dynasty. When basically the Abbasids take over, his wala is transferred to the Abbasids. And so he goes and repurchases his freedom from them because he doesn't consider them legitimate. He is a big collector and musannif. He is reported to have written around 70 works. None of them really survive. But according to our sources, 2 of these works were Awzāʿī devoted. He has the Musannaf and Siyar. And so he's kind of following, especially when it comes to Siyar al-Awzāʿī that he wrote but doesn't survive, he's kind of following in the footsteps of al-Awzāʿī in terms of both practice and theory of jihad, because he supposedly also himself participated in the expeditions against Cyprus when the Abbasids resumed the hamalat, the raids against Cyprus. But I think this anecdote here at the bottom that kind of really encapsulates what Al-Walid ibn Muslim was trying to do, which is I guess I'll read it so that you can see it. حدثنا الوليد بن عتبة والعباس بن الوليد قال لما أخذ الوليد بن مسلم في التصنيف أتاه شيخ من شيوخ المسجد فقال يا فتى جد فيما أنت فيه فإني رأيت كأن قناديل مسجد الجامع قد طفئت فجئت أنت فأسرجتها. Persevere in what you are doing because it is as if the lamps of the Umayyad mosque have been extinguished and you've relit them. So the light of ilm in Syria in the aftermath of the Umayyads had gone, and what al-Walid ibn Muslim is trying to do is kind of relight it, restart it. But al-Walid ibn Muslim kind of gives the torch to a second, a succeeding scholar, and that's Abu Zur'a al-Dimashqi. Now, in that generation, in the 3rd century, he's not the only one. We have someone called Duhaym, who dies in 245, who is usually considered also a Hanbali of sorts, so he's included in Hanbali sources. He studies under Ahmad ibn Hanbal and Abu Mushir, both of whom are affected by the Mihna. But the most important figure is Abu Zur'a. So much so that Gerhard Conrad, who had written a book about the Awzāʿī, actually argued that he is the main architect of Al-Awzāʿī and that Al-Awzāʿī wasn't really an important figure until Abu Zur'a showed on the scene. Personally, I don't agree with that assessment, but there's no doubt that Abu Zur'a was an important aspect of kind of continuing what Al-Walid ibn Muslim and people of that generation started. And so this is kind of ties back a little bit, and Jawad kind of got me thinking about the emergence of this idea of walaya. So the image of Awzāʿī spreads beyond the Syrian context, and he considered as kind of the arbiter of the probity of Syrians. So you see here a statement by Abdurrahman al-Mahdi that basically, if you meet a Syrian and he loves al-Awzāʿī, then he's kind of, you can trust his probity. So the orthodoxy of a Syrian is judged by al-Awzāʿī. And also kind of as you get into later sources, you see that al-Awzāʿī is at this point put kind of in the same rank as Malik himself. So you have Al-Awzāʿī in Syria and Malik in Hijaz. And you see that in that anecdote here. And I've actually found it without Malik. So you find that story that Al-Awzāʿī went to pilgrimage, saw Sufyan al-Thawri was leading his camel through the streets of Mecca and saying, "Make way for the Sheikh." And then in this version of the anecdote, you have both Sufyan al-Thawri and Malik basically taking al-Awzāʿī around. And this is pretty symbolic in itself. So I think at this point, one can see that al-Awzāʿī is a good window to look at Syrian Orthodoxy, at least if you don't want to say the late 1st, early 2nd century, at least 2nd and 3rd century Syrian Orthodoxy. And this reputation of Al-Awzāʿī that he is one of the main a'imma, the a'immat Salaf, to a certain extent continues into the modern period. And you see that he lands in some of these modern works about a'immat Salaf, partially because of some statements attributed to him that he advocated عَلَيْكَ بِأَثَارِ السَّلَف, and kind of the importance of that. The thing is, what I'm about to do now is that I'm going to make one of the a'imma of the Salaf speak about a Salaf. And in order to do that, we're faced with a big conundrum, is that Al-Awzāʿī himself, like the Salaf, is silent. He hasn't left any works himself. There are reports that he wrote at least 2 books, but supposedly these were burned in an earthquake in Beirut. But we have to keep in mind this issue of writing down books and what that means in that early period. In either way, in order to make Al-Awzāʿī speak, we have to go to his key transmitters, and the sources that we have are varied enough, even if limited, to give us a good idea. And the thing is, today, as I was listening to Shahnaz speaking, I was kind of contrasting a little bit between the sources that I have and you have, and kind of as we go back in time, kind of the source material gets kind of more rarefied. So the main sources that we have are Al-Radd ala Siyar al-Awzāʿī by Abu Yusuf al-Qadi. The other source that hasn't been actually exploited as much as Al-Radd is Al-Siyar of Abu Ishaq al-Fazari. That's actually a more expanded edition came out the last 5 years or so. So that also hasn't been looked at as much. And typically, people will also look at اختلاف الفقهاء, and a good source too is كتاب الجرح والتعديل, and the تقدمة الأوزاعي features as one of the أئمة الجرح والتعديل. So, how do we reconstruct from these sources Al-Awzāʿī's view of the Salaf? Now, I have to, though, start with a bit of a caveat. You can tell immediately from the title, it's a Radd. So it's a polemical work that engages with Awzāʿī's legal opinion in warfare. So that's also, just as an aside, sadly, we don't have works of this kind of ikhtilaf or Radd of Awzāʿī dealing with other kind of like ritual law or anything like that. There you have to go and extract that from other sources. So this is a polemical work where Abu Yusuf al-Qadi is supposed to have written in defense of his teacher Abu Hanifa. And what you see from the structure of the book itself, where it starts with قال Abu Hanifa, then قال al-Awzāʿī, and then قال Abu Yusuf, is that it does seem that Al-Awzāʿī had written something or had a collection of opinions in which he's responding to Abu Hanifa. And this is part of this Syrian-Iraqi rivalry, particularly when it comes to rules of jihad, the laws of jihad, where the Syrians saw themselves as the experts on the topic. And there are all definitely sayings attributed to Awzāʿī saying, what do the Iraqis know about jihad? The caliphs never would have gone and asked them questions about that. This is basically our thing. And then this source itself, Al-Radd ala Siyar al-Awzāʿī, is what's used by Al-Shafi'i in Kitab al-Umm and the Siyar al-Awzāʿī. If you compare it, this is basically it, word by word. He just adds his kind of assessment of the disagreement. And happily for me, at least, is that he agrees with Al-Awzāʿī most of the time, despite the problems in some of what he does. So overall, it's just 68 mas'alas that he deals with. I just wanted to kind of give you a bit of an idea of the polemical nature, how it gets a little bit harsh, is that Abu Yusuf kind of criticizes the reliance of Al-Awzāʿī on some of the a'immat or mashayikh Syria who don't even know how to do their ablutions or know what the tashahhud is. So this is kind of a pretty pointed, and there are other examples of that where like anyone who would know the sunnah wouldn't even say that. So there are some polemical statements in there. So looking at kind of quantifying a little bit of the mas'alas and what kind of authority Al-Awzāʿī goes back to, obviously the prophetic precedent is there. As we all know from the study of these texts, there's not an isnad, really usually appended when it's the prophetic precedent is followed. But the largest percentage is actually references to a kind of communal, collective precedent. Now, the communal collective precedent is at times used as an addition to the prophetic precedent. So you have to keep that in mind. So obviously, if there is a prophetic precedent, Al-Awzāʿī is using that. And at times, he will reference the communal, collective precedent of the community, and we'll talk about who that might be. And sometimes he will just rely on that when, I guess, he did not have a prophetic precedent. Now, and just to speak to your presentation, the companions are very seldom actually mentioned in there, at least in this case. Just to kind of give you an example of what kind of precedent that's communal here is basically no leader or scholar among them objected. So basically the fact that Muslims are practicing something on the frontier. That basically here in the case, it's if two armies, Muslim armies, joined each other, what do you do with the spoils? Do they share them or not? Basically, the way the opinions, the mas'ala is built on kind of like, that's what they're doing, no one objected, so that's what we do. So this is kind of, basically, it's almost like a salaf that's built on the practice of a community at the frontier. And so this kind of unnamed collective, there's kind of number of different, and it varies. So there's the A'immat al-Muslimin, and even at times just the army. That's what they're doing, and so that's what I will use to form my kind of the precedent for the legal opinion. As for named authorities, especially when it comes to companions, there's only 6 individuals mentioned. Now, there is the question of the nature of the text, that it is kind of a discussion, mas'alas back and forth, a Q&A, that could be part of the reason why this is happening, but it is interesting that comparatively speaking, it's the prophetic example, the community, and then kind of named authorities and the companions. Now, how about the word salaf? And this is, we go back to how Dr. Melchert basically discussed the use of salaf. It's used 2 times in الرد على سير الأوزاعي by Awzāʿī himself, and 1 time by Abu Yusuf, and clearly we all agree that it's not in a technical term. But it does help us kind of pinpoint and think through who are the Salaf, those who came before. And the first example is interesting here. Basically, it's, if you notice, فيما سلف. قال الأوزاعي كان أئمة المسلمين فيما سلف حتى هاجت الفتنة من بعد قتل الوليد بن يزيد لا يسهمون للبراذين. Kind of, this is a sub-question within the issue of how much do you pay, what's the share of a man in warfare. And so, do you give him 2 shares or 1 share, depending on if he has a horse or not? And then within that, which kind of horse? And so mules or non-Arab horses are kind of not something you do that. But there's 2 issues here that I want to go back to that are important for us. The second example is قال الأوزاعي رحمه الله وكان من سلف من علمائنا يقولون عليه أدنى الحدين ماء الجلدة. And so this is go back to the issue of practicing the hudud in the frontier. Do you do that or not? And in this case of sexual transgression, do you or don't you? And so he says yes, but the key here is من سلف من علمائنا. So the main observations that I want to note here is that in the first case, it looks like the salaf here is in reference to a time period. Man salafa is a historical period of normative practice, while the second case is an invocation that's more, it's man salafa min ulama'ina. So it is a scholarly precedent that's being said that he is using. But the more interesting point, at least from my perspective, is the cutoff point. Where do the Salaf stop? Because we've made the references before last day, and then this is kind of a noun, well-known kind of fact, the issue of the qarn, and that's like, where does it stop, 2 or 3? While here we see in the Syrian context of al-Awzāʿī within the law of warfare, it stops with al-fitna, but not the fitna you'd think. It's the fitna of al-Walid ibn Yazid. And this is important in the Syrian context, and we have to think of it from that perspective. And also, I will end with that. I want us also to think about that this is specifically about law of warfare. We need to see whether it applies in other types of law. But the fitna of al-Walid ibn Yazid is if basically the Walid ibn Yazid is assassinated and Syria falls into chaos. And factionalism starts between the Qais and the Yemen, and that violence also affects Damascus itself. And actually, it touches and affects scholars. And in fact, 2 of the Syrian ulama are assassinated during that time. Umayr ibn Hana is killed, and his head is paraded in the Umayyad mosque. And basically, the predecessor of al-Awzāʿī, who took basically the job of Qadi of Dimashq, is also assassinated. So basically, al-Awzāʿī is told, do you want to serve as Qadi? He refuses. The man who says yes and takes it is killed. So here you see there's kind of the way the violence affects the scholarly community, but also the Umayyad armies are key in kind of creating this cutoff for the Salaf. So the thing is this the only time he uses this terminology? It occurs in 3 mas'alas, kind of identifying kind of the end of this collective behavior, this collective practice that you follow in the frontier areas, to kind of the end of that with al-Walid ibn Muslim. And so the first one comes in this case of selling the war captives, is this allowed, selling them, but trading them off? And basically he's like, وَلَمْ يَخْتَلِفْ فِي ذَلِكَ إِثْنَانْ حَتَّى قُتِلَ الْوَلِيدُ. And again, in the second statement, here you see that he first mentions the prophetic example, then he mentions the 2 companions, and then he says it's a continued practice, and this continues to be until al-Walid ibn Yazid, and then after that, you can't follow that practice because the practice stops. So the thing is, the problem with kind of the Kitab al-Radd ala Siyar al-Awzāʿī is that here it's a polemical work, and the question is, can we see that in other sources? So I went to look through Siyar Abu Ishaq al-Fazari to examine the mas'alas that are there that are attributed to al-Awzāʿī. And just kind of as a quick note, Abu Ishaq al-Fazari basically was a disciple of al-Awzāʿī. Their relationship was both personal, they've met face to face, but it continued in letters. And so you see in the Kitab Siyar that he says, قال الأوزاعي سألت الأوزاعي, but occasionally كتبت إلى الأوزاعي, and that he replied to him. And basically the 2 stars of Siyar is Sufyan al-Thawri and al-Awzāʿī. So it's always kind of these 2 together. And there's 80 mas'alas in there. This cutoff point of Salaf stopping with al-Walid ibn Yazid is not explicitly stated there. But what this source tells us is that there are kind of similarities in terms of who's the precedent. And this kind of collective precedent of the practice on the frontier is still the largest percentage in the mas'alas themselves in Kitab al-Siyar. So it's either the Muslims or the armies or the imams agreed. Now, in terms of named individuals, it's again the same pattern, where we see that only in 25 cases out of 80, there's references to companions and their precedent. But otherwise, it's again these the collectivity, the practice of the Muslims. Now, in terms of the time limit, is it up until the time of Al-Walid ibn Yazid? It's not said explicitly, but there are a few examples where Al-Awzāʿī refers to the practice of military leaders, just as in the case here of Maslama ibn Abd al-Malik, and there's a major typo, sorry, Ibn Abd al-Malik here, who dies in 121. And so here also for me, what's interesting is that Awzāʿī is kind of a personal observant of what's happening. We were with Maslama ibn Abd al-Malik in an army in the land of the Turks. So Al-Awzāʿī is using his own personal experience of observing what's being practiced on the frontier to use it for legal precedent. So, in conclusion, since we have only a minute left, and by the way, this is like for archaeologists, a very interesting kind of look at things. What's the status of treasure that you find in foreign lands in the Dar al-Shirk? Do you take it or not? So, but that's a tangent. So, in conclusion, I know that this is kind of a very limited scope of who the Salaf is and a very small corpus, but at least what we can say that in legal matters, especially when it comes to warfare, Al-Awzāʿī's Salaf were embodied in the frontier communities themselves. They manifested in their discipline, and they are tied to the political order, meaning to the Umayyad dynasty itself, and that the end of the Salaf is associated with the Umayyad collapse and kind of the end of that political order, rather than any hadith-related thing such as the issue of the Qur'an. And that this happens, that this break in practice is due to the fitna that comes in the aftermath of the assassination of Al-Walid ibn Yazid. Thank you.